October 15th, 2016. 1:50 p.m. Oak Haven Chapel, Portland, Oregon. The music had been playing for 11 minutes. The guests were still smiling, assuming she was just nervous. Benjamin stood at the altar, straightening his tie for the fourth time. Down the hall, behind a closed door, his bride said 4 words to her maid of honor. "Give me 1 minute." Then the door closed, and Elizabeth Park was never seen again. Not for 478 days. This story only gets darker from here, so make sure you're subscribed if you want the full truth. The morning of October 15th, 2016 looked exactly the way a wedding morning should look. Low clouds over Portland, the smell of rain on cold stone, and inside Oak Haven Chapel, the controlled chaos of flowers being arranged, chairs being straightened, and a wedding videographer checking his battery for the 3rd time. Nothing was wrong. Everything was exactly as planned. At 1:45 p.m., the wedding videographer captured what would later become the most examined piece of footage in the Portland Police Department's history. 12 seconds of ordinary video. Elizabeth Park, 29 years old, laughing at something her bridesmaid said, reaching up to adjust the edge of her veil, then turning and walking confidently toward the East Wing corridor. Her dress caught the light from the stained glass windows as she moved. She looked like a woman walking toward the best day of her life. No one watching that footage at the time felt anything was wrong. Why would they? At 1:50 p.m., the head bridesmaid Sarah walked to the bridal room door and knocked. Elizabeth answered immediately, her voice calm, unbothered, completely normal. For words through a closed door. "Give me 1 minute." Sarah stepped back into the corridor to wait. Around her, photographers were repositioning. Relatives were finding their seats. The wedding organizer was checking her clipboard. The corridor was, by every account, completely crowded. There was not a single gap in the timeline of who was standing where. 6 minutes passed. At 1:58 p.m., the wedding organizer noticed the music had completed its 3rd full loop. Benjamin was still at the altar. The guests were still seated. The aisle was still empty. She walked to the East Wing, knocked on the bridal room door herself, and received no answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. She tried the handle. The door was not locked, but it felt heavy, resistant in the way old chapel doors do. She pushed it open slightly, called Elizabeth's name into the gap, and heard nothing but the sound of her own voice returning to her. She closed the door and went to find the groom. What happened in the next 7 minutes would be replayed, re-examined, and debated for the next 478 days. Benjamin and Elizabeth's father broke the door open together at 2:05 p.m. What they found inside was a room of approximately 150 square feet containing a dressing table, a bouquet of white roses, a tube of lipstick, and absolutely nothing else. The single window was locked from the inside with a rusted padlock that forensic experts would later confirm had not been opened in at least a decade. The door they had just broken open was the only entrance. The corridor behind them had been full of people the entire time. Elizabeth Park had not walked out, had not climbed out, had not been carried out. She had simply stopped existing in that room. And the dog that was brought in an hour later traced her scent directly to the center of the floor, sat down, and refused to move further in any direction. At 3:17 p.m., the first police units arrived and immediately cordoned off the chapel. What should have been a straightforward missing person situation. Woman leaves venue, emotional breakdown, cold feet, began unraveling within the first hour of investigation. Because the more the detectives looked at the bridal room, the less sense it made. The window was eliminated within 20 minutes. The padlock was original hardware from the 1920s, the paint seal around the frame completely unbroken. No one had touched it in years. The door was eliminated just as quickly, not because it was locked, but because of the opposite reason. It hadn't been locked at all, which meant that if Elizabeth had simply walked out, she would have walked directly into a corridor containing her bridesmaids, her photographer, 2 relatives, and a wedding coordinator. Not one of them saw her leave. Not one of them stepped aside. There was nowhere to step aside to. By evening, the search had expanded into Forest Park. 5,000 acres of dense Pacific Northwest woodland directly behind the chapel. Hundreds of volunteers lined up in chains, moving through undergrowth, calling her name. Dog units worked the Wildwood Trail. Divers went into the Wampt River near St. John's Bridge, feeling along the bottom in water so dark their flashlights barely penetrated 2 feet ahead. Police helicopters swept the tree line with thermal cameras until the battery life ran out. They found nothing. Not a footprint. Not a fiber from a wedding dress. Not a single disturbance in the mud that the evening rain had already begun to wash smooth. The investigation's lead detective noted something in his report that night that didn't receive much attention at the time but would become deeply significant later. The sniffer dog assigned to the bridal room had not simply lost the scent at the door or in the corridor. It had followed the scent to a specific point, the center of the room, approximately 4 feet from the dressing table, and stopped completely. The handler tried to redirect the dog 3 times. Each time, the animal returned to the same spot, circled it once, and sat down. In the handler's professional experience, that behavior indicated one thing. The scent ended there. Not at a window, not at a door, in the middle of an empty room with no exits, which raised a question no one could answer yet. If she didn't walk out and she didn't climb out and the scent didn't lead out, then in what direction did Elizabeth Park actually go? The investigation quietly began, considering a 4th possibility that the official reports were careful not to name directly. Not escape, not abduction through the door, not through the window, but down. Except when detectives requested the building schematics from the chapel administration that first week, the documents showed nothing beneath the east wing except solid foundation. Concrete poured in 1923. No basement access. No utility tunnels. No sublevel rooms of any kind. So they closed that line of thinking and went back to the forest. For 478 days, they kept looking in the wrong direction. February 5, 2018 began as an ordinary Tuesday for the construction crew hired to replace Oak Haven Chapel's heating system. The old cast iron pipes, original to the 1920s build, had finally deteriorated beyond repair. The work was routine, unglamorous, and entirely confined to the basement level, a long-forgotten storage space that the current chapel administration used for broken pews and outdated equipment. None of the workers knew much about the building's history. None of them knew what had happened there 478 days earlier. To them, it was just an old church with bad pipes. The first complaint came before lunch on day 1. Workers started telling the foreman about a sound in the ventilation shafts. Not wind. Not the groan of old metal expanding in cold air. Something else. A low, rhythmic hum that seemed to come from inside the walls rather than through them. The foreman listened, dismissed it as pressure variance in the old duct system, and told them to keep working. But by the second day, a second problem had appeared that was harder to dismiss. A smell, coming from the eastern section of the basement, persistent and sweet in the way that decay is sweet. Something that didn't respond to chlorine treatment or ventilation. The crew started avoiding that corner of the room without being told to. On the morning of the 3rd day, the foreman pulled out the original 1920 building schematics to cross-reference pipe locations. That's when he found it. In the far corner of the boiler room, there was a plasterboard partition that didn't exist on any of the original drawings. It was painted the same dirty gray as everything around it, aged to match the walls so precisely that it had attracted no attention during the initial site assessment. It looked like it had always been there. The foreman's first assumption was practical. A damaged section of pipe behind a later addition, the likely source of the odor. He ordered it demolished. When the crowbars went into the plasterboard, they didn't hit brick. They hit metal. The workers stopped. The foreman stepped forward and pressed his palm flat against the surface. Cold, solid, industrial. He moved the flashlight along the edges and found the outline of a door, heavy, built directly into the concrete foundation of the building, with no handle on the visible side. Only a keyhole of a mechanism so complex and so covered in rust that it clearly hadn't been opened from the outside in a very long time. No one spoke for almost a full minute. The foreman called a welder. The cutting process took 40 minutes, sparks falling on wet concrete, the metal hissing and contracting against the gas flame. When the final hinge gave way and the door swung open, The air that came out of the darkness stopped everyone where they stood. Stale, heavy, layered with the smell of mold and something else beneath it that no one in that basement wanted to identify. The workers shone their flashlights through the opening. The room inside was approximately 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls were covered floor to ceiling in thick soundproofing foam, the kind used in recording studios. A bucket stood in one corner, and in the center of the room, on a soaked and rotting mattress, was a human figure. She was breathing. It took the paramedics 9 minutes to arrive. In those 9 minutes, not one of the construction workers spoke. They stood at the threshold of the metal door and watched the figure on the mattress. And the figure did not move, did not respond to their voices, did not turn toward the light of their flashlights. Her skin had taken on a bluish translucence from 478 days without sunlight. Her muscles had atrophied so severely that her arms looked like the arms of someone twice her age. Her hair was matted and her nails were black with dirt. But when the first paramedic pulled back the blanket to begin his assessment, every person in that basement took an involuntary step backward. Elizabeth Park, missing since her wedding day, was 7 months pregnant. And in that moment, every answer the discovery seemed to offer immediately collapsed into a far darker question. Because the math was simple and it was ruthless. She had been in that room, sealed behind a soundproofed metal door, for the entirety of those 478 days. Which meant the child she was carrying had been conceived inside that bunker. Which meant whoever built that room had not simply locked her inside and disappeared. He had been coming back. The evacuation was carried out in silence. When the stretcher crossed the threshold from the basement into daylight, Elizabeth raised her bony hands to her face and released a sound that made the police officers standing outside step back instinctively. Not a cry, not a scream, something between the two that none of them had heard before, the sound of a person experiencing ordinary February light as physical pain. It was the first sound she had made since they found her. At Legacy Emanuel Medical Center, the doctors who received her compiled a list of diagnoses that filled 2 pages. Profound dissociative amnesia, critical vitamin D deficiency, severe muscle atrophy, advanced post-traumatic stress disorder. The amnesia was the most significant. Her memory hadn't simply fragmented. It had undergone a complete defensive collapse, erasing everything from 2015 onward as cleanly as if those years had never existed. She remembered her grandmother's kitchen. She remembered being 12 years old. She did not remember Benjamin. When he arrived at the hospital 20 minutes after the call, he walked into her room expecting recognition. She looked up at him with the careful, polite attention of someone meeting a stranger. Benjamin sat down in the corridor and didn't move for 3 hours. The detectives attempted an initial interview that same evening. It failed almost immediately. Elizabeth barely spoke, and when she did, she returned repeatedly to a single phrase, delivered in a flat monotone that the attending nurse later described as more unsettling than crying would have been. He brought water when the lights went out. Nothing else. No description. No name. No detail beyond that one sentence, repeated until the investigators stopped asking questions. It wasn't much, but it was something, because it indicated a routine, controlled lighting, scheduled visits. This was not someone who had locked a door and walked away. This was someone who had been managing her survival deliberately, methodically, across the entire span of 478 days. The DNA results arrived 6 days later and confirmed what the arithmetic had already suggested. Benjamin was not the father. The sample was run through the National Criminal Database immediately. No match. The biological father of Elizabeth's unborn child had no criminal record, no military service record, no prior arrests. He existed nowhere in any government database. The only physical suspect in custody, a handyman named David Miller who had worked in the chapel during renovations, was released the same afternoon. No DNA match. No physical evidence connecting him to the bunker. The investigation had a confirmed crime scene, a surviving victim, and a perpetrator who existed entirely outside the reach of every system designed to find people like him. Which left one question sitting at the center of everything, unanswered and growing heavier with each passing day. Someone had built that room, had planned it, engineered it, and concealed it so perfectly that an entire police investigation had walked above it for 478 days without looking down. Who had known that building well enough to make it disappear inside itself? If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment saying, "I'm still here." I want to know who's really following this story. Benjamin Park had spent 478 days being told by professionals where to look. Private detectives had chased leads through 3 states. Psychics had pointed at rivers and forest clearings. The police had measured every inch of the surrounding woodland. None of them had thought to look at the building itself. Not at who had shaped it, who had drawn its plans, who had known the difference between what was on the blueprints and what was actually inside the walls. Benjamin was an architect. He understood something the investigators didn't think to use. Buildings remember their builders. On February 14, 2018, he walked into the Multnomah County Central Library and requested access to the historical newspaper archive. He wasn't looking for Elizabeth. He was looking for the chapel. Specifically, for its 1995 renovation, a large-scale restoration project that had modernized the heating system, reinforced the foundation, and according to one brief mention in a city planning document, involved significant work in the basement level. He found the article on the 3rd day, a single column in the September 1995 edition of the Oregonian, accompanied by a group photograph taken outside the chapel's newly restored facade. Construction crew, clergy, project supervisors. Most faces blurred or caught mid-movement, but one figure stood slightly apart from the others, a young man in a sharp suit, holding a rolled blueprint, not dressed like a laborer. The caption identified him as Simon Cross, assistant chief architect for the restoration project. Benjamin almost moved past it. Then he looked at the belt. Hanging from it was a ring of keys. Long, antique, with ornate heads, the kind of keys designed for complex internal mechanisms in old buildings. And one of them, even through the grain of the aged photograph, had a distinctive caterfoil-shaped head identical to the lock profile on the bunker door. Benjamin sat very still for a long moment. Then he looked at the face again. Sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes with a heaviness behind them that even a 1995 newspaper photograph couldn't flatten. And something in his architect's memory, trained to retain spatial details and faces from site visits, began pulling at a thread. He had seen that face before. Recently, he closed his eyes and walked himself back through October 15, 2016. The entrance of the chapel. A catering van arriving. A tall man in service uniform helping unload champagne boxes, staying near the periphery, never making eye contact with guests, but watching the entrance with the patient stillness of someone who already knew exactly how the day was going to unfold. Benjamin had held the door open for him. The man had nodded without looking up. Simon Cross, assistant chief architect of the 1995 restoration, had been standing inside the wedding as a catering worker. He had moved through the venue freely, invisibly, carrying boxes past the bridal corridor, while the room he had built beneath the chapel floor sat waiting 30 feet below. The question was no longer who had built it. The question was how long he had been watching her before he did. The answer to that question arrived not from the police, but from Elizabeth herself. On February 20th, 2018, after 2 weeks of careful preparation, clinical psychologist Dr. Alice Morgan guided Elizabeth into a session of hypnotic regression. It was considered a last resort. Elizabeth's amnesia had shown no signs of natural recovery, and with Simon Cross still unlocated, investigators needed something. A face, a detail, anything that could be used to establish his movements before the wedding day. What they got was worse than they expected. Under hypnosis, Elizabeth's voice changed. It became quieter, younger, stripped of the flat effect that had characterized every conversation since her rescue. She was back in the bridal room. She could smell the hairspray. She described hearing a knock at the door and assuming it was Sarah. She called out for the visitor to enter. The door opened. A tall man in a black priest's cassock stepped inside and closed it quietly behind him. He smiled. Not threateningly, she recalled, but with a softness that was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. Then he said the words that had apparently been the last thing Elizabeth heard before the world went dark. "You are too pure for him, my child. I have come to save your soul." The cloth was over her face before she could process what was happening. What emerged from the deeper stages of the regression was harder to listen to. Elizabeth described the ceremonies Cross conducted in the bunker. The candles he lit when he cut the power. The old yellow dress he brought. 1930s lace, smelling of age and smoke, that he made her wear instead of her wedding gown. He never called her Elizabeth. Throughout the entire 478 days, he called her only one name: Maria. Detective Galloway stopped the recording when he heard that name and immediately pulled up the cold case database. The search took 4 minutes. In November 1998, a 14-year-old orphan named Maria Santos had disappeared from St. Mary's Orphanage in Portland, last seen at a bus stop in Beaverton. Case closed as a runaway. Body never recovered. The orphanage's construction records listed one name as chief architect of its 1990s underground extension: Archibald Cross, Simon's father. Simon had been 18 years old during that construction project, working on site as his father's assistant, with unrestricted access to the basement where the foundations were being poured. Maria Santos had not run away. She had been Cross's first attempt, his original bride, taken underground 2 decades before Elizabeth, in a building his own father had designed. Elizabeth was not chosen randomly. She was chosen as a replacement. Cross had spent years watching her, documenting her, constructing an entire alternative identity around her before he ever touched the bridal room door. The yellow dress he forced her to wear had almost certainly been bought for Maria. Elizabeth had been living inside a dead girl's life for 478 days without knowing it. And somewhere outside, Cross was still free. The raid was scheduled for 5 a.m. on February 23, 2018. Getting to that moment had required one final piece: the location. Cross had vanished completely after Elizabeth's rescue, leaving behind an apartment registered to his alias Arthur Gray that contained nothing useful except a set of diaries. The diaries themselves told investigators everything about his psychology and nothing about where he had gone. But buried inside Elizabeth's recovered memories was a sensory detail that had initially seemed too vague to act on. Water. Not pipes, not rain. A continuous, overwhelming roar that penetrated her sedated state during what she believed were transfers between locations. The ground shaking beneath it. Water everywhere was how she wrote it in her recovery notes. A sound so total it replaced all other sound. Benjamin recognized it before the investigators did. As an architect who had studied Portland's historical infrastructure, he knew there was only one natural landmark in the region capable of producing that specific acoustic profile: Multnomah Falls. 620 feet of falling water generating enough low-frequency noise to render any sound made within a quarter mile effectively inaudible. And within that quarter mile, Cross's father had designed and built an abandoned hydroelectric pumping station in the 1930s. A structure with underground storage tanks, concrete walls 4 feet thick, and no registered owner since 1987. The SWAT team approached through heavy fog. Hydraulic cutters removed the gate lock-in under 40 seconds, quietly enough that nothing inside the building would have registered the sound over the waterfall's roar. The team moved through the entrance in tactical formation, sweeping each room in sequence. The central hall stopped them completely. Every wall, floor to ceiling, was covered in photographs of Elizabeth. Thousands of them, arranged with a precision that suggested not obsession in the chaotic sense, but something more methodical and therefore more disturbing. Elizabeth leaving her apartment building. Elizabeth at a coffee shop. Elizabeth in a veil fitting at the bridal boutique. Cross had documented an entire year of her ordinary life with the thoroughness of a surveillance operation, then covered the walls of his sanctuary with the results. In the center of the room, an altar assembled from objects taken from the bridal room. Her veil, one glove, her wedding shoes still perfectly white. Then the team reached the corner. A crib, handmade, constructed with evident care and considerable skill. The team criminalist approached it and immediately understood that the material was not wood. The frame had been assembled from human bones, ribs and shin bones polished to a smooth finish, arranged with the same architectural precision that characterized everything else Cross had built. Forensic examination would later confirm they were the remains of Maria Santos. Cross had kept her bones for 20 years, waiting for the moment he would need them. At the end of the main corridor, behind a steel door, a dim blue light bled through the gap at the floor. The team commander signaled the assault. When the door came down, Simon Cross was sitting with his back to them, watching a 5-second loop of wedding footage on a wall of monitors. Elizabeth laughed by adjusting her veil and walked toward the room. He didn't turn around when the lights hit him. He didn't move when the guns were raised. When the handcuffs closed around his wrists, he tilted his head slightly toward the nearest monitor and whispered, with complete calm, "She's perfect, isn't she?" The trial lasted 4 days. Cross did not deny a single charge. He sat through the proceedings with the same unnerving stillness he had shown when the handcuffs closed around his wrists, occasionally nodding when evidence was presented as if confirming details he was pleased the prosecution had gotten right. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental defect. The jury rejected it in less than 2 hours. Life imprisonment without parole. Solitary confinement at a maximum security facility in Eastern Oregon. The judge read the sentence and Cross received it with a small, private smile directed at no one in particular, then was led out of the courtroom without looking back. The case was closed. The building was sealed, and the 2 people at the center of it were left to figure out what came after. Elizabeth gave birth to a girl in April 2018. The delivery was documented only in medical records, attended by hospital staff and a social worker, with no family present. A DNA test conducted immediately after confirmed Cross as the father. Elizabeth held the infant for 11 minutes, according to the attending nurse's notes, then asked the social worker to take her. She never asked about the child again. Within 6 weeks, parental rights were formally surrendered and the girl was placed with a closed adoptive family in another state. The records were sealed. By summer of 2018, Elizabeth had legally changed her name, closed every account connected to her former life, and moved to Seattle. She left no forwarding address. No one from Portland heard from her again. Benjamin stayed. His colleagues at the architectural firm described a man who continued to function. Showed up, completed work, responded to emails, but had become somehow unreachable, as if the part of him that connected to other people had been quietly removed. He stopped talking about Elizabeth. He stopped talking about the case. The apartment they had shared remained unchanged. Her toothbrush still on the bathroom shelf. Her coat still on the rack. The faint trace of her perfume long since faded, but the coat remaining anyway. On certain evenings, colleagues who drove past Oak Haven Chapel reported seeing him standing at the fence line, looking up at the window of the East Wing bridal room. The building had been boarded up following the investigation. The city council had approved demolition, but the structure still stood, and Benjamin still came, and no one who saw him there ever felt it was appropriate to stop and ask why. He was an architect. He understood that some structures hold their shape long after they should have fallen. Then, several weeks after Cross's conviction, during the final forensic sweep of the bunker before the case files were permanently archived, a technician noticed something on the back of the heavy metal door. Near the floor, almost entirely obscured by rust and the residue of the cutting torch, barely visible unless a flashlight was held at a precise angle against the surface. Scratches, deliberate, careful, made by something small and hard. A metal buckle, possibly, or a fingernail worn down to the quick against concrete. Handwriting analysis confirmed it was Elizabeth's, written in the first days of her captivity, before the drugs and the electroshock and the 478 days had finished dismantling the person she had been. She never mentioned it during her recovery, never referenced it under hypnosis. The memory of writing it had been taken from her along with everything else. It was a message scratched into the back of a door she had no way of knowing would ever be opened. 7 words. Ben, if you're reading this, don't look for me. I'm already dead. If this case stayed with you, leave a like and share your thoughts below. I read every comment.